Today just wanted to have a quick session and a round of session and discussion around E-Pharma. It's a fairly interesting field. Both because pharma as an industry has been growing significantly over the past few years in India, as well as the fact that internet penetration and others is going up. I think this is one of the most talked about industries. So that is one element which is very interesting. Apart from that, we as Hashedin have been working with some of the larger online e-pharma companies and players themselves. But apart from that, I myself do have a fair bit of experience, having co-founded one of the leading online pharma companies back in 2015, and we ran it, raised a lot of capital, ran into regulatory and other challenges. So, by virtue of that, I do have a fair bit of experience and knowledge, and the intent of this discussion was broadly, kind of to showcase all of you and show discuss the industry dynamics. We do have a chat forum, and you guys can feel free to post your thoughts or questions within that. So the way we'll keep it is we'll have a broadly 25-30 minute of discussion and more interactive discussions post that, and would love to have all your inputs and thoughts as we go along, right? So with that, I'll just quickly share my screen and have a small presentation for our discussion, and then take it forward from there. Right. I hope you guys are able to see my presentation. Right. Good. So broadly, as I discussed, right, discuss the concept of e-pharma. What is the broad need? What is the value proposition? What are the different business models? How various things happen in the global market, because the regulations and the markets globally are very different. How the e-commerce industry and e-pharma industry in particular has grown up, and what have been the challenges for it, both from a regulatory perspective, from a market participant perspective, and others, and just orientation for all of us around that. So that's the broad intent. Now coming to the e-pharma industry, and this is a fairly busy slide, and therefore I would like to make it very simplistic. So on the first hand, the way the regulations and the way the industry works, while from the manufacturer to the consumers, there are multiple levels of distributors and retailers who come in, but a part of it is also constrained by the DNC Act of 1940. So the Drugs and Cosmetic Act does stipulate various different participants, and because pharma medicines are a life-saving kind of issue, they are extremely regulated, and therefore there is there's a manufacturer, carry-on forward agent, super stockists, distributors, retailers, and consumers. Most of them, like the distributor license is very different from retail license, is very different from stockist license, so on and so forth, right? So being a fairly regulated industry, you need specific licenses, and therefore a part of the supply chain has not been fully integrated, and it's a fairly segregated, disparate kind of industry. The second aspect is each of the especially in India, so each of the regions have their own regulation. So this Drugs and Cosmetics Act, while it's a national level act, the implementation is the state subject, and therefore each of the state implements it, and hence by nature of it, the supply chain or the distribution of it is extremely fragmented, and distributed across very huge number of mom and pop shops. I believe there are more than 100,000 retailers in the country, and more than 8 to 10,000 distributors spread across the country, right? So an extremely fragmented market. and freight with counterfeit drugs, spurious drugs, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of challenges in the way the market is structured, and because these are life-saving drugs, these are fairly expensive drugs as well, right? There is a lot of regulations and licensing which is associated with it. So when's any, most of the Indian companies, and quite a few of these companies, we've been a part of it at the initial phase, when all of us were trying to start, whether it's 1MG, PharmEasy, NetMeds, and others, MedLife, and some of the others. I think the value proposition was clearly to bring convenience for the consumer. The Indian consumer is increasingly accustomed to online buying and the convenience associated with it. There is a fair bit of margin which is spread across in the distribution and supply chain of the drugs, and therefore, how can you optimize it and bring the best value for the consumers? But more importantly, how do you ensure that the spuriousness? There are some reports, especially from the World Bank and others, that which kind of contest that as much as 16% of the medicines which float around in the country are spurious, right? How do we ensure that these spurious drugs don't enter the retail shop and actually, you have only the authentic medicines? And associated, the conditions in which the storage happens, they are significantly more appropriate. Inventory management is appropriate, so on and so forth. Finally, and one of the most important aspect is also, traceability. If there is a batch of medicine which the manufacturer believes that there is some problem with that batch of medicine, if they want to recall, in the current scenario, it's literally impossible for the manufacturer to actually bring back the set of medicines. And these have been some of the value challenges that different market participants actually saw the opportunity towards, both because the consumer behavior was changing. There is a significant amount of inefficiency in the supply chain, and a fair amount of value which is present in the entire value chain, and which is why E-Pharma as an industry actually became a fairly lucrative industry for various different participants to kind of try and enter. You would have seen more recently there have been discussions, and Reliance has entered the market by acquiring NetMeds. Amazon is planning to enter this market, but it was the first chunk or bunch of organizations or startups which actually brought it to a certain size, and now I think it makes a relevance for the larger players to actually come and enter and take this journey forward as we mature on the e-pharma journey. Okay? So that's at a brief nutshell of what the industry looks like and the dynamics about it. Right. Now let's discuss some of the business models. Right. There are various different companies having different kind of business models, but and also the DNC Act actually puts a lot of constraints. Right. So what does the DNC Act basically stipulate? And let's take a step back. Right. DNC Act was actually made in 1940. Clearly, that was the pre-independence era for India, and and there was absolutely no internet or conceivable telephone, internet, and other mechanisms which we are very conversant or fluent with. So the law which currently Indian government and Indian law of the land is actually fairly archaic and outdated. Having said that, it was written in the true spirit of the word, such that nobody is able to abuse it. It kind of stipulated certain things, that there has to be a registered pharma personnel who has to dispense the medicine, and it's not a sale process, it is a dispensation of the process, right? And how does that happen was fairly different, or the mechanism of that happening was fairly different as compared to a typical retail process. So the approval process, how would the retailer come about and do, have been very different. And while most of these things are on paper adhered to, but in practice there are scenarios, and in a country like India, where some of these situations are not fully adhered to, which kind of brings about three very distinctly different business models which various different players kind of adopted to as they were thinking about entering this market, right? So what were the three different business models? The first was a pure online marketplace, right? Wherein an organization would say, "Well, I'm just an aggregator. Let me aggregate all the demand for the medicines and ensure that I provide it to the nearest retail shop, and I'm just purely a marketplace." Right? A lot of them, were trying to do that, including Myra. To a certain extent, 1NG initially started with that experiment, and kind of went on that model, but then have moved on to a more managed marketplace. The second aspect was a significantly more managed marketplace, right? Where you choose specific retailers or marketplace participants whom you are very confident of, that who are adhering to the rules and regulations of the act. They are far more covered. They provide a little more amount of time to deliver, so the delivery time is kind of significantly larger, but they are able to provide and control the spurious and counterfeit drugs to a significantly larger extent, right? Most of the prevalent players in the market are actually following this model. And the third model is largely a pure e-commerce model, where they own the inventory, they do everything, and they ship a medicine out from one location out to the various different participants. The challenge here is, while you have significant amount of control, this is actually against the rules of the DNC Act, primarily because, as I said initially, the regulations of supply and demand is significantly a state subject, and therefore, if a person from state X or state, let's say, Karnataka, is supplying a medicine to a person in Mumbai, and that person actually consumes that medicine, and there is a negative impact or there is an adverse impact to the medicine, right? It's very difficult to trace it back, especially across the state government. And therefore, these e-commerce marketplace platforms are actually not allowed, right? In terms of the implementation of the rules and regulations. And yes, one of the larger players, NetMeds, had that as their primary model of execution, right? So these are various different business models, and will come in terms of the technical and other challenges as these companies actually built out their different models, right? Just talking about ourselves, during my time when we started Ziggy, I think we wanted to be on the right side of the law, and therefore curated and overspent in terms of the technology to create a marketplace such that it adheres to the DNC Act of 1940, to the spirit and to the T, right? And I think that itself was a challenge or a mistake in hindsight. Right. But anyways, these are the prevalent business models, and kind of let's go ahead. Uh, One of the other things that I mentioned, right, which is fairly prevalent, is that this industry is fairly growing fast. But one of the key aspects is 40% of the medicines are purely chronic. Right, for chronic patients, they have the time wherewithal to wait for the medicines to come back. So they know they consume these medicines on a daily basis, like diabetes, like blood pressure, like several others, including cancer and others, where you have this ailment, and you have to consume these medicines on an ongoing basis, and therefore you can plan your purchase, right? The 30% are somewhere between, which includes vitamins, derma, which are not so, which wherein you can potentially wait again, right? So they are not chronic ailments, but these are preventive or preventive medicines, and balance of them or balance 30-35% are acute ailments like anti-infectants, ophthal, etc., right? And pain medicines, analgesics, and others, right? This is where the time in which the delivery happens becomes extremely critical for the various different participants. And as we discussed, there are certain models which are more attuned towards this, which is a pure marketplace, which can adhere and provide that lead, which aggregate demand and provide that lead to the closest retailer who can supply you immediately. Having said that, some of the prescription verification process is not fully done in these cases, right? Clearly, the e-pharma marketplace has been growing at a fairly fast pace. It's been growing at more than 63% CAGR. So clearly, there is a significant amount of opportunity. The predicted is from barely $500 million kind of potential. It will go to 3.6. I think the overall market size for the pharma industry is around 22 to 25 billion dollars in India, and there is a significant potential for it to grow, and I believe it will continue to grow at 60% plus. Why is it happening? As I clearly articulated, right, there is internet penetration. The online players are able to provide better quality or better stored medicines at a reasonable price to the consumers, and given the COVID scenario, clearly that is the preferred mechanism of consumer behavior more than anything else, right? So that is kind of leading the growth and the consumer behavior change as it is happening. Some of the key challenges we've talked about. We've talked about at a very high level at the DNC Act of 1940 and the Pharma Acts, which got changed. But there are other challenges in terms of prescription and how the prescription is used, and therefore a doctor verification. There are scenarios. Some of the online e-commerce models are building that in. But there are, let me focus more on the structural challenges, right? These structural challenges are more idiosyncratic to the industry. And that is primarily because certain basic things like not having a common ERP across the country, not using a common master MDM or master data management, which is available across the country, right? A lot of data and data security and privacy related issues. The way the hospitals, etc., manage your prescription is not supported properly, right? So there are a bunch of very different challenges which actually are one of the precursors in the industry, and we have to kind of solve it. In some of the scenarios, right, along with some of our participants, we've actually had to go through and do some of the basic things, right? With some of our customers within Hashedin, we've actually developed the MDM or automated mechanism of MDM such that the various different participants across the supply chain have the same way of talking and that mapping across their databases. In certain scenarios, we've actually helped in developing or grooming of the ERP platform for the various different participants. So these have been some of the key basic structural challenges for the industry as it kind of was taking off, right? That's been one of the key challenges that some of our customers as well as the market has had to take through, right? Going ahead, I think let me talk about the evolution of the e-pharma and how do I see it, as well as to a certain extent where some of the developed markets are, right? So we are at the one of the first initial basic level of e-pharma as we stand. What is kind of happening at the same time is you're getting a more holistic sort of services, which is telemedicines, EHRs, lab services, home healthcare, all of them kind of group, kind of coming up with various different participants, and each of the participants kind of wanting to create that holistic set of healthcare services to come together and ensure that they are able to cater to various different requirements of the consumers, right? But I think what is more important is that as we mature, more of the insurance players would come in to see and observe, how are you as a patient of a diabetes or of blood pressure, and you have been insured by an insurance company. How do they actually are able to um, track, ensure, measure that you are consuming your medicines on time, right? Because this will impact their financial implications significantly. And therefore, a lot of PBMs, which are currently prevalent in the US markets, effectively control the way funds are moved, the way the patient's responsibility of healthcare actually is taken by them, basis the insurance level that you take forward, right? So there is a full industry which is pharma benefit manager, who segregate from an insurance company but is working on behalf of the insurance company, and kind of ensuring that the medicines and the consumption of the medicines is done properly by the consumers, right? As a next step, I think what is going to, so PBM industry is non-existent or too premature in India. I think it'll mature significantly, and I think going forward, I think as some of these guys become more stronger, there will be the providers themselves, or sorry, the payers themselves become more stronger, and the decision making will be kind of with these institutional payers, and slowly providing that flexibility to getting the best quality healthcare for the consumers, right? So if the primary provider or the doctor or the hospital does not provide the proper care, some of the cases and some of the mechanisms in which it can be addressed will be much more stronger. And this is a direct evolutionary journey that clearly that we see, that Indian healthcare to a certain extent will go through as we evolve over a period of time, right? And finally, I think overall it will become a huge overall health exchange for it to kind of become, and whether that means personalized healthcare programs, personalized medicine, so on and so forth. But there's a significant amount of potential, and let's see, as we are at interesting times, seeing the not just the adoption, but more formal entry of e-pharma in India, with the larger players like Reliance and Amazon kind of entering India, entering this space to kind of come into being, right? So that's in a brief, in terms of very quickly, about what the e-pharma industry is all about, and how do we see it, and some of the trends that we currently have. I will take a pause and look for questions from any of you, or go in for a overall discussion per se.
So Harshit, we have one question from Akshat. His question is primarily related to the e-commerce platforms. So his question is, if the inventory is held in the same state as the consumer, then are there any regulatory challenges?
Oh, the regulatory challenges are immense, right? So there are too many regulations which are managed, or which have to be adhered to by the drug inspector and drug zone and others, right? So they have to be adhered to. So there are a lot of steps in terms of ensuring that you are keeping the prescription that you are giving it out to, you are keeping and ensuring that the batch number of the medicine that you are dispensing to the consumers is basically noted down and managed properly, and such that if there is a cause of return of the medicine, that is managed properly, so on and so forth, right? So there are a lot of there are a lot of rules and regulations at the district level and the drug inspector level, which have to be adhered to, and therefore it makes it extensively complicated. And clearly, health ministry is not one of the simpler ministry or within the country.
Right.
How would the e-pharma and e-consultation industry play together? I think they will. They have to, right? E-consulting, because of the constraint that the pharmacy has to ensure that the doctor's prescription is a valid prescription. So it is actually a criminal offense for anybody to dispense a medicine which is a Schedule C drug, to dispense a medicine without a valid doctor's prescription. There are certain rules and regulations which define what is the definition of a valid prescription, and therefore those have to be adhered to. But clearly, there are a bunch of those requirements, right? The prescription should be recent enough, should not be more than 6 months old, should be the doctor's name, other details should be there. The drug and chemist has to ensure that he keeps a note of all of these. Now, a bunch of these regulations which are mentioned in the regulations are not fully adhered to by the regulatory authority, but they are required as per the legal mandate, and therefore you are subject to scrutiny if you don't adhere to some of these constraints, right? So that those are some of the challenges, and as some of you are working in e-pharma companies and looking their growth, I think that becomes far more relevant of the case. So yes, on the front end side, aggregating it from the doctor, and certain ailments are more attuned to online consultations, right? Certain ailments are not. Obviously, most of the acute patients are not, but a lot of others are attuned. There's a lot of resistance to e-pharma, especially in tier 2, tier 3 towns. How do you see that evolving, right? Obviously, there will be resistance for e-pharma, primarily because you're taking away the potential and the job opportunity for the small shop owner. These pharmacies are largely controlled and managed by the mom and pop shops, and therefore it's a livelihood. The resistance is largely by the AIOCD, or All India Association of chemists and druggists. They have been fairly constrained, and it is impacting the livelihood and the margin structure for the small mom and pop shops in the tier 2, tier 3 cities. But having said that, from a consumer perspective, I think what ePharma has been doing has been much better for them. So it will be a TIF, but I think eventually in the long term, while I do see that resistance, in the midterm, in the long term, I think the consumer is going to win, and that is broadly going to happen, right? Would the e-commerce companies be able to turn around doctors in these cities? Um, Again, the second behavioral challenge that happens in especially in some of these industries is the fact that because a larger structural player or a larger company actually comes in, there is a need for the doctors and others to see how best can we can we extract some amount of value from them. So it is a value chain struggle. In the healthcare, clearly the doctor has a lot of power and potential. So how does that happen is something which has to be seen. But clearly, I do expect that these e-commerce companies and online consultation has been bringing that amount of change within the consumers and will continue to do so, right? So hopefully that they'll become far more prevalent and important. Right now, the company has most differentiated basis their business models. The companies are mostly differentiated basis their business model. What are some of the ways in which two players having same business model can differentiate themselves in the space? Okay. A lot of them, right? So one part is the business model, but how do you, I mean, the key in this entire game is execution, right? There is a acute patient out there. What are the challenges? There are approximately 10,000 there are approximately 100,000 different SKUs of medicines which is expected, which a consumer might need, which is prevalent all across India, right? An average pharma store stores anywhere between 2,000 to 5,000 medicines, right? So there are so many, so often that you'll go to a pharma store, you ask for a medicine and they'll say, oh, it's not available, right? So, what are the ways to differentiate? Availability is a huge challenge that consumers face. So, given a business model, I think availability of medicines is a key component of differentiation, right? Mm, Pricing for sure is a point of differentiation. The time of in which you can provide the medicine back to the consumers, right? Each minute counts, especially if it is acute ailment, right? And the more acute the ailment, the better and faster that you deliver it back, it becomes important. Fourthly, how well do you manage the delivery of the medicine? I mean, what is the percentage of orders that you reject? Because I can guarantee you in India, more than 50% of the people who are buying medicines don't have what is called, as I described, a valid prescription for the medicine. Right now, if you start saying if you don't have a valid prescription for the medicine, you've lost 50% of the consumers directly, and they are not going to have a happy experience out of you. So they are going to be rather annoyed with you, right? And how do you, balance that act? I think clearly we ourselves have seen that very differently play out in MedLife Express versus MedLife, but those are the changes and how the consumers will behave. That's the key differentiation, Himanshu, is the execution mechanism more than the business model itself, right? One of the questions from Govinda is Hashedin is evolving as an expert in data engineering. Now, ePharma has a lot of data, obviously. How do you think we can use our expertise in helping these companies? And what sort of offerings we should come to help these companies? I think this traverses two parts of the entire journey, right? The first part of the journey is, can you potentially take that information and put that information across to other providers, right? For example, for example, Govinda, you might be a patient of XYZ ailment, or in your family there's somebody who's suffering for, let's say, a blood pressure or something else. Can I provide some value-added services, etc., and sell you, right? Some of the regulations like HIPAA do not allow for that. Some of these regulations of data management, etc., are fairly loose-ended in terms of the DNC Act, right? So I think apart from the regulatory challenges, I think there is a fair bit of value which can be provided to the consumers, and the value add has to come from the consumer organization or the client or the partnership of organizations of ours, given the fact that we are largely a services, technology services company as far as data engineering is matched. Um, Going ahead, I think Srinath has a question. There are more opportunities to engage doctors by pharma. Earlier, it was more of a manual process by the MRs. Any focus on that? Yeah, this again is one of those which trespasses some of the ethical standards, because some of the practices which have traditionally been followed by the MRs and the manufacturers with the doctors have not been of very high ethical standards, right? Can technology play a role? For sure it can. Will it help the overall society? Yes, it will. Will it help the regulator? Will it help the manufacturer? Will it help the doctor? Yes, definitely. But we would have to bring all the doctors onto the single platform. We will have to bring various different manufacturer onto the single platform, and believe me, it's a challenge, right? So getting adoption in terms of technology from the doctor community is going to be a tough challenge and a constraint, and it's not going to be easy. So is this a viable idea? Yes. Does it make sense? Maybe. Would I put money on it? Not really. Right. So that's the short answer for it. But yeah. So good. I think that's all. I think thanks all for coming in, and it was a nice discussion. Thank you.